When authority mistakes silence for weakness begins with a familiar imbalance, one person clothed in official power, the other expected to comply without question. Authority relies on predictability. It assumes that commands will be met with nervous explanations, apologies, or submission. Silence disrupts that expectation. Silence is not loud, not aggressive, not visibly defiant, yet it introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is kryptonite to unchecked power. When an authority figure encounters calm restraint instead of fear, the encounter shifts. What was meant to be routine starts to feel personal. The official story fractures because it was never designed to withstand composure. Silence is often misread as consent or ignorance. In reality, it can be observation. It can be calculation. It can be the deliberate choice to let someone reveal themselves fully. Authority figures who depend on intimidation frequently mistake quiet for weakness because they are trained to escalate when dominance is not immediately affirmed. The absence of panic feels like a challenge, not because words were spoken, but because the expected emotional hierarchy has been violated. The person in control is no longer controlling the emotional temperature of the situation. Unchecked authority is fragile. It needs validation at every step. When silence removes that validation, irritation creeps in, tone sharpens, body language stiffens. The language of procedure slowly mutates into the language of threat. Each escalation is justified internally as necessary, even righteous. The authority figure convinces themselves they are restoring order when in fact they are exposing insecurity. The quieter the other person remains, the louder the authority becomes, mistaking volume and force for legitimacy. Silence also denies the authority figure a narrative. Without verbal resistance, there is nothing to quote, nothing to paraphrase, nothing to twist into justification. This absence forces improvisation, and improvisation reveals character. In moments like these, power shows whether it is rooted in discipline or ego. Those driven by ego cannot tolerate ambiguity. They need the other person to play their role in the script. When that script is ignored, frustration becomes action. Calm silence has another effect. It slows time. It forces moments to stretch. In those stretched moments, decisions are made without the cover of chaos. The authority figure chooses to escalate consciously, not reactively, and those choices leave fingerprints. Every gesture becomes deliberate. Every word becomes evidence. Silence does not protect the authority figure, it preserves the record. The danger arises when authority believes it must break silence to reassert dominance. This is where mistakes compound. What began as a minor exercise of power turns into a test of ego. Each step forward is justified by the last, and retreat becomes impossible without admitting error. Silence becomes an accusation, not spoken but felt. The authority figure responds not to a person anymore, but to their own fear of appearing weak. A routine stop that turned into a career-ending mistake often starts with familiarity. Routine is deceptive. It breeds complacency. It convinces professionals that today will be like yesterday, that procedures are muscle memory rather than choices with consequences. Routine creates shortcuts in judgment. It allows assumptions to replace verification. When an authority figure believes nothing significant can happen during a routine encounter, vigilance fades and entitlement grows. The phrase routine stop carries psychological weight. It frames the encounter as insignificant, disposable, forgettable. That framing lowers the perceived risk of misconduct. If nothing matters, then nothing will be scrutinized. This is how boundaries erode. Small liberties are taken because they are expected to go unnoticed. The stop becomes less about safety or compliance and more about control, convenience, or curiosity. The danger of routine is that it encourages automation of behavior without reflection. The authority figure relies on patterns rather than facts. They stop seeing individuals and start seeing categories. The interaction becomes less about what is happening and more about what usually happens. This is where misjudgment thrives. When reality does not match expectation, Irritation replaces inquiry. Career-ending mistakes rarely feel dramatic in the moment. They feel justified, they feel earned. The authority figure believes they are handling a minor disruption, not realizing that every action is being weighed against standards far higher than personal comfort. Routine dulls the sense of accountability. It creates the illusion that oversight is distant or non-existent. That illusion collapses the moment evidence enters the equation. What transforms a routine stop into a catastrophic error is escalation without necessity. Escalation turns observation into confrontation. Confrontation invites scrutiny. Each escalation narrows options. De-escalation requires humility, and routine authority does not reward humility. The system often rewards assertiveness, decisiveness, and confidence, even when misplaced. When those traits are exercised without restraint, they mutate into recklessness. The authority figure may believe they are enforcing compliance, but compliance achieved through pressure is unstable. It invites resistance, whether immediate or delayed. Even when the other party remains calm, the internal resistance grows. The stop ceases to be about resolution and becomes about dominance. That shift is invisible to those accustomed to power, but obvious to systems designed to evaluate abuse. Career-ending mistakes are often preceded by moments where correction was possible. A pause, a question, a verification. Routine bypasses these safeguards. It encourages continuation rather than reassessment. When someone in authority doubles down instead of stepping back, they trade control for momentum. Momentum is dangerous because it carries actions forward even when judgment falters. The presence of recording devices transforms routine into permanence. What was once ephemeral becomes archival. Authority figures who rely on routine underestimate this shift. They behave as if memory is selective, forgetting that technology is impartial. Cameras do not understand routine. They record only actions. They do not contextualize intent. They preserve behavior. In this environment, routine mistakes are no longer buried, they are replayed. The career-ending aspect is not rooted in a single action, but in a sequence. One decision justifies the next. Each justification becomes harder to defend. What could have ended quietly instead accelerates. The authority figure becomes trapped by their earlier choices. Admitting error would unravel the narrative they have constructed, so they persist. Believing control can still be reclaimed. Routine also breeds overconfidence in institutional protection. The authority figure assumes that even if something goes wrong, the system will cushion the fall. This belief encourages risk-taking. It erodes caution. It replaces professionalism with entitlement. When the system does not protect them, the shock is profound. The realization arrives too late, after the record is complete, after witnesses exist, after escalation has crossed lines that cannot be uncrossed. What makes these moments irreversible is not public outrage or external pressure alone, but the clarity of evidence juxtaposed against the banality of the initial encounter. A routine stop was supposed to be forgettable. Instead, it becomes defining. The authority figure's entire career is reinterpreted through that lens. Past actions are re-examined. Patterns are questioned. What once passed as routine is now seen as precedent. The silence of the other party during the stop often becomes the loudest testimony afterward. It exposes the imbalance. It strips away excuses. It leaves no emotional outburst to blame. What remains is behavior, uninterrupted and unprovoked. In that stillness, the authority figure's actions stand alone, unsupported by context or justification, suspended in a moment that continues to unfold long after the stop itself has ended, long after the paperwork is filed, long after the routine has been shattered, and the consequences are still accumulating, unresolved, pressing forward without relief, without reversal, without the comfort of forgetting. Continuing to exist in records, in memory, in scrutiny, in review. In systems that no longer accept routine as an explanation, still watching, still measuring, still waiting for accountability to finish what escalation began. The moment a single decision changed everything is rarely recognized in real time. It does not arrive with ceremony or warning. It slips into existence disguised as a minor choice, a split-second judgment made under the illusion of control. In positions of authority, these moments occur constantly, but most pass without consequence because restraint intervenes. When restraint fails, the moment hardens into something permanent. The decision is made not because it is correct, but because it is available. Convenience replaces judgment, impulse replaces assessment. This moment is shaped by what came before it. A series of unchecked assumptions builds pressure beneath the surface. Authority convinces itself it understands the situation before understanding the person. Expectations narrow perception. The mind stops asking questions and starts issuing conclusions. When a decision emerges from this state, it is less a response than a declaration. It signals not what must be done, but who is in control. The danger of a single decision lies in its ability to eliminate alternatives. Before it is made, multiple outcomes are possible. After it, the field collapses. Escalation locks the path forward. De-escalation becomes psychologically expensive because it requires admission of misjudgment. Authority figures often fear that admission more than the consequences of doubling down. Pride. Reframe stubbornness as strength. This decisive moment is also where accountability enters the equation. Systems are designed to tolerate human error, but not human willfulness. When a decision is clearly discretionary, clearly avoidable, it becomes traceable. Traceability turns mistakes into responsibility. The moment is no longer abstract. It is time-stamped, recorded, witnessed. It becomes the pivot point upon which narratives turn. What makes this moment transformative is not the action itself, but the intent inferred from it. Observers, investigators, and institutions do not only ask what happened, they ask why escalation was chosen when restraint was available. That question lingers. It reshapes how every subsequent action is interpreted. Innocent explanations lose credibility. Neutral actions acquire context. The single decision retroactively colors the entire encounter. Once made, the decision begins to demand loyalty from the person who made it. The authority figure feels compelled to defend it, justify it, reinforce it. This creates a feedback loop. Each new action is taken not because it is correct, but because it supports the original choice. Reversal becomes betrayal of self-image. The person becomes invested in the mistake. In this moment, power often mistakes decisiveness for correctness. The faster the decision, the more confident it appears. Confidence is persuasive, especially to those conditioned to obey it. But confidence does not equal legitimacy. When scrutiny arrives later, speed becomes recklessness. What once looked commanding now appears careless. The same decisiveness that impressed in the moment condemns in retrospect. The moment also reveals how authority handles uncertainty. True professionalism absorbs uncertainty and delays action until clarity emerges. Fragile authority eliminates uncertainty by force. It acts to restore internal comfort, not external order. This is why the decision feels relieving in the moment. It resolves discomfort. It silences doubt. But that relief is temporary, and the cost is deferred. The aftermath of this moment is rarely immediate. Consequences incubate. Reports are written, footage is reviewed, statements are compared. The decision is replayed from angles the decision-maker never considered. Context shifts. Power evaporates. What remains is conduct. In that environment, intent is reconstructed from behavior, not claimed afterward. The decision is no longer owned by the person who made it. It is owned by the record. This is why single decisions carry disproportionate weight. They are clean, they are identifiable, they offer a clear before and after. Institutions gravitate toward these moments because they simplify accountability. Instead of examining every variable, they examine the pivot. Everything else becomes supporting evidence. The decision becomes the anchor point around which responsibility is assigned. Power, ego, and the line that was never meant to be crossed exists at the intersection of authority and identity. Power is functional when it is impersonal. It becomes dangerous when it merges with ego. Ego seeks affirmation. It needs to be seen, obeyed, validated. When authority becomes a mirror for ego, boundaries blur. Enforcement turns into expression. Control becomes personal. The line that should never be crossed is not always codified. It is often ethical rather than procedural. It exists in restraint, in judgment, in the understanding that authority is borrowed, not owned. Ego rejects this framing. Ego believes power is deserved, that compliance is owed. When ego governs authority, the line becomes invisible until it is already behind them. This crossing rarely feels transgressive to the person crossing it. Ego reframes excess as necessity. It convinces the authority figure that escalation is justified by attitude, by tone, by perceived disrespect. The line shifts from objective conduct to subjective feeling. Once feelings become grounds for action, professionalism dissolves. Authority begins responding to emotion rather than behavior. Ego thrives on asymmetry. It requires someone beneath it. When the other party does not perform deference, ego interprets neutrality as insult. Silence becomes defiance. Calm becomes provocation. The authority figure feels diminished, not because control was challenged, but because reverence was withheld. That perceived slight becomes the catalyst for crossing the line. The line is crossed incrementally. Rarely does someone leap over it knowingly. Instead, they step closer under the belief that proximity still equals safety. Each small violation normalizes the next. Tone sharpens, space is invaded, language hardens. What once would have felt inappropriate now feels earned. Ego rationalizes escalation as correction. What ego fails to recognize is that power magnifies consequences. Actions taken under authority carry institutional weight. They do not belong solely to the individual. When ego drives those actions, the institution inherits the risk. This is why organizations respond aggressively once the line is crossed. They are not only addressing misconduct, they are containing exposure. The line also marks the transition from authority to liability. Before crossing it, the system protects the authority figure. After crossing it, the system protects itself. Loyalty dissolves quickly when ego jeopardizes legitimacy. The individual becomes expendable. This shift often shocks those who believed power guaranteed insulation. Ego blinds authority to observation. It assumes invisibility. It forgets witnesses. It discounts documentation. It underestimates the permanence of records. Ego acts as if the moment exists only between two people, ignoring the broader environment. When the record contradicts ego's narrative, ego collapses into denial. Denial prolongs damage. Instead of recalibrating, ego defends. Defensiveness invites scrutiny. Scrutiny reveals patterns. What began as a single incident expands into a history. The line crossed becomes the doorway through which everything else is examined. Ego's attempt to preserve status accelerates its loss. The line is also psychological. Once crossed, the authority figure cannot return to neutrality within the same encounter. The dynamic has changed. Trust is broken. Fear enters. The other party is no longer interacting with an institution but surviving an individual's volatility. This shift alters memory. It sharpens recollection. It motivates documentation. It activates outside systems. Ego miscalculates endurance. It assumes the other party will fold. When that does not happen, ego escalates further, believing pressure will eventually restore dominance. This miscalculation is often fatal to careers. Endurance exposes ego. It forces continued escalation or retreat. Retreat requires humility. Ego chooses escalation. The line that was never meant to be crossed exists precisely to prevent these spirals. It is the boundary that separates enforcement from abuse, authority from tyranny. When crossed, the narrative is no longer about compliance or safety. It becomes about misuse. Every subsequent action is filtered through that lens. Once ego-driven authority crosses that line, time works against it. The moment does not fade. It accumulates attention. It attracts analysis. It invites interpretation from those immune to intimidation. The authority figure loses control of the story. The story becomes larger than the individual. It becomes symbolic. Symbols demand resolution. Institutions respond decisively to restore credibility. The authority figure, once confident, finds themselves isolated. Power evaporates. Ego has nothing left to sustain it. The line they cross now defines them not as an enforcer, but as an example. Replayed, reviewed, cited, taught, referenced in trainings and hearings, lingering in institutional memory, shaping policy revisions, influencing oversight, persisting beyond intent, beyond apology, beyond explanation, continuing to exist as a moment that cannot be undone, only examined, only contextualized, only absorbed into a broader reckoning that keeps unfolding long after the decision was made and the line was crossed and the illusion of control had already begun to dissolve. Why calm resistance is more dangerous than anger begins with a misunderstanding that has shaped authority encounters for generations. Anger is visible, it is loud, it announces itself as a problem that can be labeled, managed, and neutralized. Calm resistance does none of that. It offers no spectacle, it does not raise its voice or rush forward. Instead, it stands still, forcing authority to confront itself without distraction. This is why calm resistance destabilizes power more effectively than rage ever could. Anger gives authority a script. It justifies escalation. It provides a narrative of disorder that can be documented and defended. Calm resistance denies that narrative. It refuses to perform the role expected of opposition. Without anger, authority cannot easily claim threat. Without threat, force feels unjustified. That gap creates anxiety. Authority accustomed to controlling outcomes suddenly finds itself controlling nothing but its own reaction. Calm resistance exposes the emotional dependency of power. Authority often relies on fear, submission, or outrage to validate its position. When none of these appear, the authority figure is left alone with their intent. Their words hang in the air without impact. Commands lose momentum. Silence stretches. The encounter becomes uncomfortable not because of danger, but because of reflection. This discomfort provokes escalation. Authority that is insecure cannot tolerate equilibrium. It must tip the balance. Calm resistance feels like stagnation, and stagnation feels like loss. To restore motion, authority pushes. Each push reveals impatience. Each raised voice reveals fragility. Calm resistance does not need to act. It only needs to remain unchanged while authority changes around it. There is also a psychological asymmetry at play. Anger is exhausting. It burns quickly. Calm resistance conserves energy. It waits. Authority misreads this waiting as weakness, not realizing it is discipline. Discipline frustrates those who rely on dominance because it cannot be rushed. The more authority presses, the more the contrast sharpens. Calm resistance also attracts witnesses. People notice composure. They remember restraint. When recounting events later, calm resistance becomes credible. It appears reasonable. Anger, even when justified, complicates memory. It blurs timelines. Calm resistance clarifies them. Every escalation appears one-sided. Every raised voice stands out against stillness. This is why calm resistance becomes dangerous to authority after the encounter ends. It survives scrutiny. It translates cleanly into testimony. It aligns with records and recordings. Authority cannot claim provocation when none existed. Calm resistance removes excuses retroactively. What felt like defiance in the moment becomes dignity in review. Authority figures who escalate against calm resistance often feel betrayed by the aftermath. They believed escalation would restore control. Instead, it created contrast. That contrast becomes the story. Not what was said, but how it was said. Not what was demanded, but how it was enforced. Calm resistance turns authority's intensity into evidence. There is also a moral dimension. Calm resistance implicitly asserts equality. It does not beg. It does not challenge overtly. It simply refuses to collapse. This refusal undermines hierarchies built on emotional submission. Authority that depends on being feared cannot tolerate being met as an equal. Calm resistance feels like disrespect because it does not acknowledge dominance as natural. This misinterpretation fuels further escalation. Authority convinces itself it must teach a lesson, but lessons enforced through power reveal insecurity, not strength. Calm resistance exposes this. It invites authority to overreach, to prove its relevance through action. Each action deepens exposure. Calm resistance also disrupts timing. Anger accelerates interactions. It pushes toward resolution, whether fair or not. Calm resistance slows everything down. It forces authority to choose patience or impatience. Impatience becomes visible. Time stretches enough for observation, enough for recording, enough for witnesses to gather. The most dangerous aspect of calm resistance is that it transfers agency. Authority expects to direct the encounter. Calm resistance refuses to be directed emotionally. Authority can command actions, but it cannot command demeanor. That loss of control is intolerable to fragile power. Escalation becomes a substitute for persuasion. In hindsight, calm resistance often appears prophetic. It seems as if the person knew escalation would occur. In reality, calm resistance simply allowed escalation to reveal itself. Authority exposed its own threshold. Calm resistance did not force the mistake. It created the conditions for it to occur without interference. The cost of escalation in the age of cameras is no longer theoretical. Escalation used to dissipate with memory. It relied on discretion, on incomplete records, on competing narratives. Cameras have ended that era. Escalation now persists. It can be replayed, paused, zoomed, analyzed. Every gesture acquires permanence. Authority figures who escalate are no longer acting in a moment. They are acting for an audience they cannot see. Acceleration feels immediate and decisive. Cameras transform it into something enduring and cumulative. What once felt like asserting control now feels like forfeiting it. The authority figure no longer owns the narrative. The record does. Cameras do not contextualize emotion, they capture behavior. They flatten justification, they expose sequence. The cost begins with loss of ambiguity. Escalation thrives on confusion. It relies on blurred lines and conflicting accounts. Cameras erase those conditions. They establish timelines. They preserve tone. They show proximity. Authority can no longer rely on memory gaps to soften actions. Escalation becomes exact. This exactness changes institutional response. Organizations are risk-averse. When escalation is visible, institutions calculate exposure. They compare actions against policy not in spirit, but in frame-by-frame detail. Escalation that once might have been excused now becomes indefensible. The cost shifts from individual to systemic. Escalation also invites comparison. Viewers compare similar encounters. Patterns emerge. What was once framed as isolated becomes repetitive. Cameras reveal frequency. Authority figures who escalate believe they are handling a unique situation. Cameras reveal they are repeating behavior. Repetition erodes credibility. The presence of cameras also democratizes judgment. Authority is no longer evaluated solely by supervisors. It is evaluated by the public, by analysts, by attorneys, by commentators. Escalation becomes subject to interpretation by people immune to intimidation. Authority cannot posture for them. The power dynamic collapses. Another cost is temporal. Escalation happens fast. Consequences unfold slowly. Investigations take months. Reviews take years. During that time, the footage remains static. It does not fade or soften. Authority relives the moment repeatedly through replays. Each viewing strips away adrenaline and leaves only conduct. Escalation also alters language. Words spoken in heat sound different in silence. Commands sound harsher. Threats sound clearer. Tone loses its justifying urgency. Cameras capture the mismatch between claimed fear and displayed aggression. That mismatch becomes central to accountability. The age of cameras also means escalation multiplies. One recording spawns others. Bystanders film. Dash cams sync with body cams. Audio aligns with video. Escalation that once existed in isolation now exists in layers. Authority cannot control all angles. Each new angle adds cost. Escalation further costs trust. Even when legally defensible, it damages legitimacy. Viewers form opinions not on statutes, but on perceived fairness. Escalation feels unfair when alternatives were visible. Calm resistance highlights those alternatives. The camera shows restraint was possible. That possibility becomes the measure. Authority figures often misjudge this environment. They believe compliance will erase footage. They believe explanations will override images. Cameras invert that logic. Images override explanations. Escalation that looks unnecessary cannot be explained away. Words trail behind visuals trying to catch up. The cost also extends inward. Authority figures experience cognitive dissonance when watching themselves escalate. They remember fear. The camera shows confidence. They remember threat. The camera shows calm opposition. This dissonance breeds defensiveness. Defensiveness deepens institutional conflict. Escalation also narrows future options. Once footage exists, authority cannot negotiate quietly. Settlements, suspensions, reforms become public. The institution must respond visibly. Careers hinge not on intent, but on optics. Escalation damages optics irreparably. The most profound cost is cultural. Cameras have changed expectations. The public now expects restraint as default. Escalation feels archaic, a relic of unaccountable eras. Authority figures who escalate appear outdated, untrained, unfit for modern standards. The footage becomes a training tool for what not to do. Calm resistance paired with cameras is especially potent. It creates a clean contrast. Escalation appears gratuitous. The authority figure cannot claim chaos or danger. The camera shows stillness. That stillness becomes an indictment. The cost is not just disciplinary, it is reputational. Escalation in the age of cameras also accelerates reform. Policies change because footage exists. Training adapts because mistakes are visible. Authority figures who escalate become case studies. Their actions outlive their careers. The cost extends beyond the individual into institutional memory. Every escalation now carries the weight of future viewing. Authority figures act not only for the present but for endless replay. Those who forget this pay dearly. Those who escalate against calm resistance create the most damning footage because nothing distracts from their behavior. The calmness amplifies every excess. In this environment, restraint is no longer optional. It is strategic. Escalation is no longer decisive. It is self-sabotage. Authority that fails to recognize this pays in lost credibility, lost protection, lost future. Cameras do not forgive urgency. They do not honor adrenaline. They only preserve action, tone, distance, sequence, leaving authority exposed to judgment that does not expire, does not tire, does not forget, continuing to exist as a permanent witness that cannot be persuaded, cannot be intimidated, cannot be silenced. Watching escalation unfold again and again as the cost continues to rise without pause, what happens when evidence can't be buried begins at the moment control is lost. Evidence is power inverted. It removes discretion and replaces it with permanence. When evidence exists, authority no longer decides what matters. The record does. Attempts to bury evidence are rarely about truth. They are about delay. Delay creates hope that attention will fade, that memory will soften, that urgency will dissolve. But evidence resists time. It waits. It does not decay with repetition. Each review strengthens it. Once evidence is secured, narratives collapse. Justifications that sounded convincing in isolation fracture when placed beside recordings, timestamps, and corroboration. Small inconsistencies grow large. Language is parsed. Tone is dissected. Intent is inferred not from explanation, but from sequence. Authority that once relied on discretion discovers that discretion has been replaced by audit. The inability to bury evidence triggers panic. Panic accelerates mistakes. Actions meant to conceal become actions that confirm guilt. Each attempt to interfere leaves its own trace. Systems designed to preserve data notice tampering. Oversight mechanisms activate. What began as a single incident expands into an investigation. Evidence multiplies as others come forward, emboldened by proof that denial is no longer viable. The presence of evidence also shifts leverage. Those who were once silent gain voice. Whistleblowers emerge. Patterns surface. Evidence connects dots that were never meant to be connected. Authority loses the ability to isolate incidents. What was framed as anomaly becomes habit. Habit becomes culture. A system that protected the wrong people for too long is revealed not through accusation but through accumulation. Systems rarely announce corruption, they normalize it. Protection is framed as loyalty. Complaints are reframed as misunderstandings. Patterns are dismissed as coincidence. Over time, this tolerance becomes endorsement. Such systems are efficient at deflection. They absorb criticism without changing behavior. They protect reputations instead of principles. The wrong people learn that consequences are negotiable. Each survival reinforces confidence. The system teaches them what they can get away with. Evidence disrupts this equilibrium. It bypasses internal filters. It speaks directly to external oversight. The system's reflex to protect is exposed as complicity. Leaders who once claimed ignorance face documentation. Silence becomes untenable. Distance becomes impossible. It's an active torture. It's acts of physical endurance and patience honored before they are welcome. When a system is forced to confront evidence, it must choose between reform and collapse. Protecting the wrong people becomes too costly. Loyalty shifts abruptly. Those once shielded become liabilities. The system rewrites its own narrative, claiming shock at behavior it quietly enabled. The exposure is not just individual, it is structural. Policies are questioned, training is scrutinized, incentives are examined. The system is no longer judged by intent, but by outcomes. Evidence reframes responsibility upward. What cannot be buried eventually defines the system that tried. The longer protection lasted, the harsher the reckoning. Trust erodes, legitimacy fractures, repair becomes slower and more public. Evidence does not just end careers, it rewires institutions, forcing acknowledgement of what was allowed, who benefited, and how long it was permitted to continue under the cover of authority and routine and silence. The difference between authority and accountability is revealed when consequences arrive. Authority acts in the moment, accountability acts afterward. Authority is granted, accountability is earned. One operates on permission, the other on proof. Authority can command, restrict, and enforce, but it cannot validate itself. Accountability requires explanation, consistency, and alignment with standards beyond personal judgment. When authority is exercised without the expectation of review, it drifts toward convenience. Accountability pulls it back toward responsibility. Authority often assumes compliance equals correctness. Accountability asks whether compliance was justified. Authority relies on hierarchy. Accountability relies on record. When both exist together, power functions properly. When authority outruns accountability, excess becomes normalized. The gap between them is where misuse thrives. When one arrest exposed an entire network, the illusion of isolation collapsed. Systems built on repetition fail when one incident is documented clearly enough to invite comparison. A single arrest becomes a reference point. Other cases align around it. Similar methods, similar language, similar outcomes surface. What was defended as individual discretion becomes recognizable as pattern. Patterns threaten institutions because they imply intent rather than error. Once intent is inferred, responsibility spreads. Supervisors are questioned, processes are audited. Silence is reinterpreted as approval. One arrest becomes the thread that unravels a broader structure, pulling forward records that were never meant to be examined together, forcing acknowledgement of coordination, tolerance, and shared benefit. Why this case changed a department forever was not because of outrage alone, nor because of punishment, but because it dismantled assumptions that had been treated as immovable. Departments operate on habits long before they operate on policies. Culture fills the gaps between written rules. For years, those gaps had been occupied by tolerance, rationalization, and quiet protection. This case forced those gaps into the open. It made visible what had been managed privately and excused informally. Once seen, it could not be unseen. The case altered how authority was interpreted internally. Officers who had relied on precedent rather than policy found themselves exposed. "This is how we've always done it" ceased to be a defense and became a liability. Supervisors who had ignored complaints realized that silence now carried evidentiary weight. Inaction was no longer neutral, it was participation. The department had to confront the uncomfortable truth that misconduct did not survive by accident, but by permission. Training changed because the narrative changed. Previously, emphasis had been placed on tactics, compliance, and command presence. After the case, emphasis shifted to judgment, restraint, and articulation. Officers were no longer trained solely on what they could do, but on what they should avoid doing. The presence of real footage altered instruction. Hypotheticals lost credibility. The case became a reference point, replayed not as a warning in theory, but as a demonstration in fact. Policy revisions followed, but they were reactive, not visionary. They acknowledged failure rather than preventing it. New language was added to procedures, but the deeper change occurred in enforcement. Violations were no longer negotiable internally. The department understood that external oversight was now vigilant. Leniency carried risk. Accountability became procedural rather than discretionary. The case also disrupted loyalty structures. Officers who had depended on informal alliances discovered that those alliances dissolved under scrutiny. When protection became costly, it evaporated. Trust within the department fractured along ethical lines. Those who had complied quietly questioned their own silence. Those who had spoken previously felt vindicated. The internal hierarchy reorganized not by rank, but by credibility. Community relations shifted as well. Public skepticism hardened into expectation. Transparency was no longer a gesture, it was demanded. The department lost the benefit of the doubt. Every interaction was now interpreted through the lens of the case. This heightened scrutiny was uncomfortable, but clarifying. Officers learned that professionalism was not something assumed, but something demonstrated repeatedly. The department's relationship with oversight bodies changed permanently. Federal agencies, civilian review boards, and internal affairs units were no longer peripheral. They became central actors. Data reporting increased, metrics were scrutinized, patterns were flagged early. The department transitioned from reactive defense to proactive compliance, not out of reformist zeal but out of necessity. Leadership selection was affected, promotions became risk calculations, past conduct was re-examined, associations mattered. Leaders understood that inherited culture could no longer be defended. They were evaluated not only on performance, but on integrity signaling. The case created a leadership vacuum that could only be filled by those willing to disrupt tradition. The psychological impact on officers was significant. Some experienced defensiveness, interpreting reform as distrust. Others experienced relief, seeing boundaries clarified. The ambiguity that once allowed misconduct also allowed uncertainty. Clear expectations reduced both. The department became more rigid, but also more predictable. Predictability reduced conflict internally and externally. This case changed how reports were written. Language became cautious, precise, and deliberate. Officers understood that reports would be read comparatively. Vague phrasing invited suspicion, overstatement invited contradiction. Accuracy became protection. Documentation shifted from narrative justification to factual recording. This change alone altered behavior in the field. Technology adoption accelerated. Camera systems were upgraded, data retention expanded, access protocols tightened. The department recognized that technology was not an enemy, but an inevitability. Resisting it only amplified suspicion. Embracing it offered conditional legitimacy. The case also influenced recruitment. Candidates were screened more aggressively for temperament and decision-making under stress. Psychological evaluations carried more weight. The department sought individuals less attracted to authority as identity and more to service as function. This shift was slow but deliberate. Why this case changed a department forever is also because it altered fear. Previously, fear was externalized, projected onto civilians. After the case, fear turned inward. Fear of review, fear of exposure, fear of becoming the next example. This fear constrained behavior more effectively than any policy ever had. Over time, it evolved into caution, then professionalism. The department's narrative changed publicly. It could no longer rely on slogans or assurances. Credibility had to be rebuilt through consistency. This required enduring criticism without retaliation. Silence replaced defensiveness. Listening replaced explanation. The case forced humility. Internally, the case became a line of demarcation. Officers spoke of before and after. Before, discretion was expansive. After, it was narrow. Before, mistakes were managed quietly. After, they were documented. Before, escalation was tolerated. After, it was questioned. The case also exposed generational divides. Younger officers adapted more quickly, accustomed to visibility and accountability. Older officers struggled, having operated under different assumptions. Some retired early, others adjusted. The department's demographic composition shifted accordingly. Union dynamics were affected. Defensive posturing became less effective. Arbitration outcomes changed. The union recalibrated its strategy, focusing more on procedural fairness than blanket defense. The case demonstrated that some battles could not be won without damaging credibility further. Why this case changed a department forever is because it clarified that legitimacy is fragile. It is built slowly and lost quickly. The department learned that authority granted by law does not guarantee trust granted by community. Trust must be earned continuously, especially after failure. The case also influenced neighboring departments. Policies were reviewed regionally. Training materials were shared. The ripple effect extended beyond jurisdiction. No department wanted to be next. This created a quiet, competitive reform environment driven by avoidance rather than aspiration. Ah, Baba. The internal language of accountability evolved. Terms like bad apple lost relevance. Focus shifted to systems, incentives, and oversight. The department acknowledged that individual misconduct thrives in permissive environments. Reform targeted structure, not just behavior. Why this case changed a department forever is also because it redefined what survival meant institutionally. Survival was no longer about protecting personnel at all costs. It was about preserving legitimacy even at the expense of individuals. This recalibration was painful but necessary. The department's historical record was reinterpreted. Past incidents were revisited. Complaints were reopened. Some cases were reclassified. The archive became active. History was no longer inert. It became evidence. This transformation did not occur cleanly. Resistance persisted. Some officers resented the shift. Morale fluctuated. But over time, a new equilibrium emerged. Expectations stabilized. Conduct aligned with scrutiny. The case forced the department to articulate its values explicitly. Ambiguity was no longer safe. Values were written, enforced, measured. Deviations were addressed promptly. Culture moved from implicit to explicit. The department's relationship with the media changed. Press strategies shifted from deflection to disclosure. Briefings included data. Errors were acknowledged early. This transparency reduced speculation and rebuilt incremental trust. Why this case changed a department forever is also because it demonstrated that reform imposed externally is different from reform embraced internally. Initially, change was imposed. Over time, it became internalized. Officers learned that restraint protected them as much as it protected civilians. The case influenced how authority was taught. Command presence was redefined. It no longer meant dominance, it meant control of self. This conceptual shift altered field behavior subtly but persistently. The department learned that the cost of prevention is lower than the cost of defense. Investing in training, oversight, and technology was expensive, but cheaper than settlements, reputational damage, and federal intervention. The case also affected disciplinary timelines. Investigations became faster. Prolonged uncertainty was recognized as harmful. Resolution, whether punitive or exculpatory, became a priority. Why this case changed a department forever is because it ended plausible deniability. Leaders could no longer claim ignorance. Data systems made patterns visible. Oversight made excuses transparent. The department's internal narratives about heroism shifted. Heroism was no longer defined by confrontation, but by restraint. Stories shared internally highlighted de-escalation successes. Recognition followed behavior aligned with new standards. The case also impacted retention. Some officers left voluntarily, others stayed and adapted. New recruits replaced attrition. Over time, the department's character shifted. The department's future planning incorporated risk assessment differently. Scenarios considered not just immediate outcomes, but downstream consequences. Decision-making models included reputational impact. Why this case changed a department forever is because it forced alignment between values, policy, and practice. Misalignment had been tolerated. The case exposed the cost of that tolerance. The department learned that authority exercised without accountability corrodes from within. The case served as proof. Proof is difficult to ignore. The transformation was uneven, imperfect, and ongoing. But the trajectory changed. The department could not return to its previous state without conscious regression. The case became institutional memory. New officers learned it during onboarding. Veterans referenced it during discussions. It became shorthand for consequences. Why this case changed a department forever is also because it demonstrated that accountability, once activated, does not deactivate easily. Oversight persists. Expectations remain elevated. The department now operates under a different social contract. Authority is conditional. Trust is provisional. Legitimacy is contingent on behavior. The case reshaped incentives. Promotion favored those with clean records and strong judgment. Risk-takers were scrutinized. The department also learned that silence from leadership during crises is interpreted as complicity. Communication became structured and timely. Why this case changed a department forever is because it taught that reform is not an event, but a process triggered by exposure. The case reframed failure as data. Errors became learning opportunities rather than secrets. The department's self-image evolved. It no longer saw itself solely as enforcer but as institution, under constant evaluation. The case also influenced budget priorities. Funds shifted toward oversight, training, and technology. Why this case changed a department forever is because it proved that systems can change when consequences are unavoidable. The department emerged more constrained, more cautious, and more aware. And the sentence that sent a message nationwide extended the impact beyond jurisdiction. Sentencing is symbolic. It communicates values. When a sentence is severe, it signals intolerance. When it is lenient, it signals acceptance. This sentence was unmistakable. The sentence reframed consequences nationally. It demonstrated that misconduct under color of law carries weight beyond employment termination. It reasserted that authority does not immunize behavior. It corrected a long-standing perception that accountability stops at administrative discipline. The decision to elect embassies was not. The sentence also validated victims. It acknowledged harm not as incidental, but as central. This validation mattered. It reinforced faith in judicial systems that many had doubted. For law enforcement nationwide, the sentence served as a warning. It clarified that escalation without justification can lead to criminal liability. It challenged assumptions about prosecutorial reluctance. The sentence influenced prosecutorial strategies. Attorneys cited it as precedent. It emboldened charges previously considered risky. It shifted calculus. The sentence also affected training curricula nationally. Academies incorporated it into ethics modules. Legal consequences were emphasized alongside tactical instruction. The message was clear. Misconduct is not merely a policy violation, it is a crime. The sentence altered internal risk assessment for officers. Decisions were reconsidered. Restraint became self-preservation. December 19th, 2 a.m. The sentence also influenced union negotiations. Defense strategies adjusted. Settlements were reconsidered. The sentence sent a message to supervisors. Responsibility does not stop at the point of contact. Failure to intervene carries consequence. The sentence resonated with communities. It suggested that justice systems can respond proportionally. National media amplified the message. Coverage extended beyond the case. It became emblematic. The sentence also affected legislative discussions. Lawmakers referenced it when debating reform. The message was not punitive for its own sake. It was corrective. The sentence clarified that authority is conditional upon conduct. The sentence demonstrated that the judiciary recognizes the power imbalance inherent in authority misuse. The message traveled because it was unambiguous. For officers committed to professionalism, the sentence offered reassurance. Misconduct would not define the profession. For those inclined toward abuse, it offered deterrence. The sentence reinforced that cameras, evidence, and accountability converge. The message did not fade quickly. It was referenced repeatedly. The sentence redefined risk. The sentence underscored that careers can end not gradually, but abruptly. The sentence elevated standards. The sentence reinforced that justice is not optional. The sentence contributed to a broader reckoning. The sentence aligned law with expectation. The sentence closed a chapter but opened others. The message continues to circulate, shaping decisions in moments of stress, reminding authority that restraint is not weakness, that silence is not submission, that evidence is permanent, that systems remember, that accountability arrives eventually, that choices accumulate, that power is temporary, that legitimacy is earned, that no position insulates conduct from consequence, that every action exists beyond intent, beyond context, beyond justification, continuing to resonate in training rooms, courtrooms, briefing rooms, and quiet moments before decisions are made, where authority pauses or fails to pause, knowing now that the sentence was not just punishment but precedent, not just closure but signal, still echoing through institutions that understand they are being watched and measured and judged in ways that cannot be negotiated or ignored or delayed any longer. If this story stayed with you longer than you expected, that's not an accident. Stories like this don't fade quickly because they aren't just about what happened, they're about what could happen again if no one is paying attention. Power doesn't correct itself. Systems don't heal on their own. Accountability only exists when people refuse to look away. If you're still here, it means you understand that. It means you recognize that silence can be dangerous, that evidence matters, and that truth only survives when it's witnessed, remembered, and shared. This channel exists for that exact reason, not to provoke outrage for a moment, but to preserve clarity long after the headlines disappear. When you subscribe to this channel, you're not just supporting a creator. You're choosing to stay informed, to stay alert, and to stay engaged with stories that expose how decisions ripple outward, how small moments become defining ones, and how justice is never guaranteed unless it's demanded. Every subscription strengthens this platform's ability to keep these narratives alive and visible, especially in a landscape where uncomfortable truths are often buried beneath distraction. If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel unsettled, that's a signal. Share it with someone who believes accountability matters, someone who understands that restraint is strength, that authority must answer to the same standards as everyone else, and that systems improve only when they're challenged. Sharing isn't just amplification, it's participation. It's how these stories reach beyond algorithms and into conversations that matter. Take a moment to leave your thoughts in the comments. Not a reaction, a reflection. What moment changed everything for you? Where do you think accountability truly begins? With individuals? With systems? Or with the people who refuse to accept silence as an answer? These conversations don't just drive engagement. They shape the direction of what stories get told next. If you've watched this far, you already know this channel isn't about quick consumption. It's about deliberate attention. The stories here are chosen carefully, structured intentionally, and told with purpose. Subscribing ensures you don't miss the next one. The next case where power is tested, where decisions matter, where truth doesn't arrive quietly. Turn on notifications if you want to be there when the next story drops, not days later, not after it's already been discussed elsewhere, but at the moment it enters the conversation. Early engagement doesn't just help the channel grow, it ensures these narratives reach people while they're still fresh, while they can still influence perspective. Endorsing this video with a like may seem small, but it tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve visibility. It pushes substance over noise. It helps counterbalance content designed only to distract rather than inform. Each interaction strengthens the signal that audiences want depth, not just drama. This channel will continue to bring stories where restraint reveals truth, where evidence dismantles excuses, and where accountability reshapes systems. If that's the kind of content you believe deserves space, stay here. Be part of this audience. Be part of the reason these stories don't disappear. Because attention is power now, where you choose to place it determines what survives.